Welcome, everyone, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight who have registered for the OWLA Public Forum. And as in the past, we will have our presentation, just to give you a little idea of the layout. We'll have our presentation and some question and answers at the end. And we'll just ask that you mute yourselves, and we'll go from there. So I should have started with introducing myself because there are so many new names here with us tonight. I am Ann Robson, and I am the current president of the Owasco Watershed Lake Association. And we are proud to be presenting our August public forum. This evening, we are going to learn a lot about atmospheric ammonia deposition. And it's such an important topic as we're trying to understand the changes that are occurring in our lake with the tendency of having more of the harmful algal bloom and high toxic levels when those blooms occur. So this evening, we're most fortunate to have Tom Butler, who is a visiting fellow with the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at Cornell University. He also serves as site manager for the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York. His presentation, Atmospheric Ammonia Deposition, an important source of nitrogen in the Finger Lake watershed, will describe work he's doing to look at this phenomenon, starting with the Skaneateles watershed, and now this year in 2023, his work within the Owasco watershed. So I'd like to introduce Tom and appreciate your opportunity to share with us tonight. So please go right ahead.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to thank OWLA for all of their support in helping us get set up on Owasco Lake to start sampling here. You folks have been a great help. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues who are involved with this. Bob Howarth, who's actually the principal investigator, Dennis Swaney, Roxanne Marino, Colleen Baublitz. And those are all Cornell people, and Colleen Baublitz and Greg Beachley are with the EPA. And I noticed that Bob is here too, so he can correct me if I make any statements that don't seem to jive. Okay, so why is ammonia deposition important? And I'm going to talk about Skaneateles mainly, and then at the end, concentrate a little bit on Owasco. But Skaneateles has started seeing harmful algae blooms like all of the Finger Lakes, and 2017 stands out. And although Skaneateles and also Owasco Lake are phosphorus limited lakes, nitrogen can contribute to the toxicity of blooms because cyanobacteria toxins are very nitrogen rich. Energetically, cyanobacteria prefer reduced forms of nitrogen, such as ammonia and ammonium, as opposed to oxidized forms, such as nitrate. And over the last 20 years or so, we have switched from atmospheric deposition, largely driven by oxidized forms such as nitrate, to now reduced forms such as ammonium and ammonia. They have become the dominant forms of nitrogen deposition. So here we're going to look at gaseous ammonia dry deposition and how that's delivered to the lake and contributing to the overall nitrogen load. And particularly the ammonia is one of the major sources are dairy farms. Speaking of which, this is a map that shows where some of the agricultural activity is the heaviest in the Finger Lakes. This is actually a map of the acreage that's needed for spreading manure on the land. And here's the Skaneateles and Skaneateles watershed. I'm getting some feedback. Are other people hearing that?
Yes.
I am. If we could just ask everyone, place yourself on mute. Appreciate that.
Okay, so yeah, that's much better. Thank you very much. So you can see there's quite a few large agricultural operations around Skaneateles, but if you look here, and here's Owasco Lake, you can see that upwind of Owasco, there's quite a few large concentrated animal feeding operations in that area too. So we would expect to see actually higher concentrations of ammonia in the Owasco watershed. Just some comparisons between Skaneateles and Owasco Lake. Skaneateles is deeper by about 50%. Skaneateles has a very small watershed compared to the size of the lake. The watershed to lake ratio is 5 for Skaneateles, whereas Owasco it's 19. So Owasco has a much larger watershed compared to the surface area of the lake. And retention time, in other words, how long the water stays in the lake. Skaneateles has 16-year retention time, whereas Owasco it's only 3 years. So there's more through flow through Owasco than Skaneateles. Some other statistics: Skaneateles is an extremely clear oligotrophic lake, and Owasco is considered a mesotrophic lake, medium nutrient level as compared to a low nutrient level like Skaneateles. The clarity that's measured by the Siki disk, which is lowered into the water, and when it disappears from sight, or when you can first see it, bringing it up from the depth, that's the Siki disk reading. And you can see Skaneateles is much clearer. One of the reasons being chlorophyll A, and again, these are annual averages. Higher levels in Owasco, which you would expect in a more productive lake. The N to P ratio is also higher. And agriculture, there's 49% of the watershed is rated as agriculture, whereas it's closer to a third in Skaneateles. And the amount of forest and shrub and grasslands are similar for each. So getting back to ammonia. So we've been measuring ammonia concentrations as part of a national network of over 100 sites. And we're measuring it in southwestern Tompkins County outside of Ithaca. And we started measuring in 2007 when the network first began operations. And you can see that over time, the ammonia concentrations have been increasing. And if people want to know more about why this might be, I can talk about that later, but I don't want to get into those details right now. Anyways, ammonia concentrations are increasing, not only here in the Finger Lakes, but pretty much all over the country. So how do we measure ammonia? Well, we have a very nice, simple system, these passive samplers, no electricity required. Air diffuses into this porous blue filter here, and inside is a phosphoric acid trap, which captures, the acid captures the basic ammonia. It becomes ammonium phosphoric ammonium, and then this sampler is then sent to a central lab where it is. It's the same lab we're actually a sub-network of the national network. They do the analysis, and with certain algorithms, they can calculate what the concentration is over. We generally do this for a 2-week period, and they can concentrate. They can very accurately measure the concentration, the average concentration over 2 weeks. And we've run them up to a month, and that works very well also. So it's a very simple system. They work very well. It's under a rain shelter, which is basically a 3.5 gallon bucket sawed in half. This has been tested in our lab. It's been tested in the Wisconsin lab where the analysis is done. And again, I want to repeat that I think that the accuracy of these passive samplers is quite good. So here's Skinny Atlas Lake. And here are 9 sites. 2 TB4 and TB05 are in Bear Swamp. This is a forested area. This is another forested area here, somewhat forested. This is at the south end of the lake. That picture at the beginning of the slideshow was taken from here. And these are more agricultural sites, TB02, TB01, TB09. So that's our network. And here is what the concentration data looks like. And what's very interesting is that all 9 sites tend to, if one site goes up, they all seem to go up. If one site goes down, they all seem to go down. So they track quite nicely with each other over each time period. So a couple of things I wanted to point out here. These 2 lower lines are Bear Swamp State Forest, and they have the lowest concentrations throughout the year. And the other major thing here is that most of the highest concentrations run from April through July, although you can get peaks after that. But this is when we have the warmest temperatures, more emissions, and this is when the concentrations tend to be highest, whereas in the wintertime, they drop off to a pretty low level. And I wanted to compare that to the concentrations from our site in Tompkins County, which has been operating since 2007. Here's data from January 21 to December 22, and you can see that the average of the Skinny Atlas sites track pretty well with the average for our long-term monitoring site. So we're measuring concentration, but what we're really interested in is how much is being deposited. And this is when it gets a little tricky. So we have used 2 models, the TDEP equates model, which is a sort of a large scale model that's measuring different forms of nitrogen all over the country. The model is broken down into 12-kilometer grids. So it has kind of a lower resolution than the stage model. The stage model is looking at the landscape in a 500-meter radius of where the sites are. So, and the stage model was designed specifically for ammonia, and specifically for this national network. We have all this concentration data, and just like we want it to convert it to deposition, the national network data, we want that converted to a national level of deposition for ammonia also. And both of these models have been in operation for a number of years. TDEP equates has been around for quite a number of years. Stage is a more recent model and is still evolving. So here are what the data look like for the individual sites, comparing the TDEP model in the red and the stage model in the blue. And the stage model data, this is very, very recent. As I said, it's an evolving model. They're still working on it. But these are the numbers that we see. Earlier models of the stage showed a higher level of deposition, but the latest models are showing a lower level. So if you take the average value, TDEP model shows a deposition of 2.91 kilograms nitrogen per hectare per year, and the stage is 2.51. Anyways, they're tracking pretty well. And we'll see how they progress. So and here's some pie charts comparing total nitrogen deposition. And the total nitrogen deposition, all the components except ammonia are from the TDEP model. And let me just go through these pieces of the pie. So here, this light blue here is the ammonia deposition. This dark green is ammonium wet deposition. And you see there's a little line here. This is dry on this side, and this is wet deposition on the other side, mainly ammonium and nitrate. And then we have a nitric acid vapor, particulate ammonium, particulate nitrate, and other species. Okay, so an important thing I want people to realize here is that most of the deposition is from either ammonia or ammonium. It accounts for about 2/3 of the deposition. And using the equates, the TDEP equates model, using our concentrations as opposed to the concentrations that the larger TDEP model uses, we are seeing about 20% more ammonia deposition using our concentration data as compared to what TDEP normally uses. And so how does this all shake out in terms of loading to Skaneateles Lake? So I had mentioned earlier that Skaneateles Lake has a small watershed compared to the lake surface. So the lake surface is about 23% of the total watershed, and direct deposition to the lake accounts for about 4% of the total nitrogen coming into the lake. If you include ammonium, it jumps up to about 12% of the total deposition coming into the lake is from atmospheric ammonia and ammonium. And then when you include the deposition that comes into the watershed and run the nitrogen loading of that through another model to estimate how much is running into the lake, we get a total reduced nitrogen load of about 29% of the nitrogen entering the lake surface. Now, I haven't said anything about nitrogen from the sediments, which would be an internal source, and we don't really have any data on that. I was at a talk that Charlie Driscoll gave to the Skaneateles Lake Association last week, and one of the points he was making is that there is a fair amount of internal loading of phosphorus when you have sediments stirred up in the lake due to basically the wind driving the lake to rock back and forth. It'll stir up the sediments. Well, there are also high levels of ammonium in the sediments too, so that may also be another source. Okay, so that was data that was largely accumulated in 2021 and 22. This year, we've kept 5 sites on Skinny Atlas Lake. One of them is over water. And now we have 5 sites on Owasco Lake, and they're located here. And 3 of them are located over water. 2 of them, like there's 2 sites right here. One's on land, TB12 is on land, TB11 is on water, or vice versa, excuse me. And then on the west side of the lake, this is Ken Post's property. We have a site on land, and then Ken Cudlett's property right on the water. We have one on the shoreline. So this is the one over the shoreline at Ken Cudlett's place on the west side of Owasco Lake. And this is our most recent site, which we just collected our first sampler this last Tuesday. And this is located in the middle of the lake. It's between Burtis and Long Point. And this is a buoy operated by the Finger Lakes Institute. And you can see here's our sampler right here. So we're really interested in what's going on over water. I talked to some of my colleagues at EPA and about this whole water issue, and their models really don't address deposition over water. So what we have done to estimate deposition over water is we measure the concentrations in the sites nearest the lake. We take those concentrations and multiply it by what they call a deposition velocity, which is the rate that you would expect ammonia to be deposited. But we would, unfortunately, the models don't seem to take into account this direct water surface deposition. So they're actually interested in what we're doing and would like to incorporate it at some point, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, is my take on it. Here's some of the most recent data, and this is just looking at the paired sites, one over land, one over water. This is for Skinny Atlas. We have 3 dates where we have the data, and the green is over land, the blue is over water. So these are somewhat paired sites. This is near Dana Hall's house, actually. Our site over Skinny Atlas Lake shoreline is at Dana's house. And then we have another, the green one is behind his house on land. So there's a difference, but not very much. Here is on Burtis Point. This is Jim Beckwith's place. And these sites are actually quite closely located. And again, we only have 2 dates here where we have the data, but not too different. And then the last one is on the west side. Oops, excuse me. Let me back up here. Oops, going the wrong way here. Okay, and then on the west side of Owasco Lake. And again, one site is at the one over water is at Ken Cudlett's place. The one over land is at Ken Post's house, which is an agricultural area. And again, they're not too different, which I suppose is a good thing. But we're really curious as to how this is going to play out. We don't have any data from out in the middle of the lake yet. And this is just sort of a summary of the data we have for the different dates. And so that's all I have now. Again, I really want to thank the Owasco Watershed and Lake Association for their help in getting us set up and operating. This all happened pretty quickly this spring when also a lot of other things were going on. So I'm open to questions, and I noticed Bob Howarth is here. So I would appreciate him chiming in if he would like to at some of the questions. And, or if he would like to add any comments. And I also noticed that Melissa Pachowski is on this, and she is responsible. She is an EPA person responsible for the operations of the National Ammonia Network. And she grew up on Owasco Lake and is now in the Skinny Atlas area. Okay.
Because of the size of the group, you're more than welcome just to ask the question. And if it gets out of hand, we can begin to go through the chat box. But thank
And
you.
also,
Yeah, somebody wanted to ask a question.
and I'll start gearing which he talked about the CAFO farms around the lake. Is there any difference if a CAFO farm has a methane digester? Does that take any of the nitrogen out? I know it takes methane out, but does it help take nitrogen out? And a second question, is there any difference now that farmers are injecting most of the liquid manure rather than spreading it on the top like they used to do 5 to 10 years ago?
I would say that a methane digester would probably produce less ammonia because the manure is most of the emissions of ammonia is largely from livestock, and which is manure. So if you're taking that out of circulation and running it through a methane digester, you would certainly get less ammonia emissions. And I would believe that you would get less ammonia emissions by injecting it into the soil. I know they do that around where I live here in Lansing, and it's certainly, I mean, you can, it's obvious with the smell of the landscape, whether they're injecting it or whether they're spreading it on the surface. So yes, I would think that injection would be a good way of reducing ammonia emissions.
Thank you. Carol? Carol, I think you're muted.
You're muted, Carol.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was still muted. Okay, can we go back one slide to the overland, the bar chart with overland and overwater? One more, I think, beyond that. Yeah, is this yeah. So for Owasco Lake, is it okay to infer that it looks like about the same amount, give or take, over water is being deposited as is coming from the land?
Well,
Is
so
that correct, or did I go too far?
so this is concentration. This is not deposition.
Okay,
And
concentration in the air. Okay.
and deposition over water is probably occurring at a different rate than deposition over land, given the same concentration. And
Okay.
again, the models don't deal with deposition over water, but there are some measurements that produce these deposition velocities that we are using to estimate what the deposition is over water.
Okay.
Now, deposition over water is probably going to be less important in the Owasco Lake area because you have a much larger watershed and a smaller lake than, say, Skinny Atlas.
So
what's deposited on land is going to have a bigger role.
right. Okay. All right. That helps. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob Howarth?
Yeah, thank you. Tom, great job, as always. And I just want to join Tom in thanking everyone who's made this work possible in the watershed area. We've had tremendous support from the community, and that's really important. I also just want to say that we're funded independently on other grants to look at the sources of ammonia volatilization off to the atmosphere and how it ties in with agricultural practices. But I have no doubt that as we move into drilling manure waste into the ground, it will reduce. It is reducing the ammonia problem, as Tom alluded. We don't have good data behind that, but there's tons of reasons to believe that's so, and we're hoping to get good data on that in the future. So, but thank you, Tom, for your hard work on this, and to all our friends and colleagues in the watershed who are helping to support this research.
Thank you, Bob. Dana?
Yes, thanks, Ann. Tom, say again, please, why is the rate of deposition different over water versus over land? Can you explain that one more time for us slow students?
Okay, it's different because it's a different surface area. It's composed of, water is different than a leaf, which, leaves that you saw the lowest levels in the forest areas. That's because they absorb ammonia quite well. Whereas if you just had a flat surface, you would have less surface area to deal with, and so that is one of the reasons. And again, in terms of water, there is not a lot of data on rates of deposition on the water surface. And again, that can be controlled by the pH of the water and other factors. So it's just a completely different landscape, the land versus the water.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
And this is an area that there's really not much information on, and I know people are interested in it, but we don't have the data.
But we will. Phil, you're next.
Thank you. Do you have any idea what the relative contribution of nitrogen is from the atmosphere versus the tributaries?
So let's see if I can go back to okay, so the tributaries are contributing a lot compared to what's coming in, and the tributaries, they're getting the nitrogen, a lot of it, from the atmosphere. So it goes through the atmosphere, generally about 24% of the nitrogen that lands on a watershed ends up being exported to either the lake or the estuary or whatever. And that's where this nanny model comes in, and it's estimating how much is being deposited to the landscape, but then it's processed and some of it is not released to the lake. But about 24%, and that's sort of an average term that's held up pretty well over time, gets exported. And because usually the watershed is much bigger than the lake surface area, you can see we have 135 metric tons coming in from the watershed, and about 20 or a little less than 20 coming in directly to the lake surface. And that's reduced nitrogen. That doesn't include, you could probably add another third would be from oxidized forms of nitrogen being deposited directly to the lake. But again, these cyanobacteria, they really like reduced forms of nitrogen. It's energetically more available to them.
Thank you. Welcome, Kirsten. Thanks for joining us.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I have a couple questions, but I don't want to take up the whole evening too, so feel free to stop me. Thanks, Tom, for a really great presentation, really interesting, and working in agriculture, right? Nitrogen's something that we deal with all the time. It's super important. One thing I'd love to know a little bit more about, I'm used to working in watershed boundaries when we think about runoff and the way nutrients work in our landscape. Can you explain the difference between, say, the watershed, and I'm thinking like the airshed might have a role to play in this kind of deposition?
Yeah, yes, definitely. So yes, it can, the ammonia can come from outside of the watershed, because the airshed is usually much bigger than a watershed. So yes, even if you're not in the watershed, but you have a lot of agricultural activity upwind of you outside of the watershed, you can still get ammonia in that respect. So yeah, the airshed is important. Now, ammonia has a short lifetime in the atmosphere, and so it generally doesn't travel large distances, whereas particulate ammonium can often travel, hundreds or 1,000 miles before it's deposited. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm trying to then understand, maybe you could explain, seem to make a direct correlation at the beginning of the presentation to livestock producers. And I do want to just make a quick clarification. We should be careful saying CAFO, and if we're talking about manure, maybe manure is the word we use.
Okay.
Farms
Okay.
of all kind, right, have manure.
Yeah.
But is there, I think something you just said just might have made it click in my head. So maybe you could help me understand if this is correct, because you said particulate. So are you saying that that's coming from the actual particles in the air that might become suspended there as a result of the physical act of spreading the manure?
No.
Okay. So then this is my real question was, can we suss out the difference between, say, if it's coming from manure versus, say, fertilizer?
So most of it, my understanding is most of it is actually from livestock production. But yes, fertilizer contributes. And the national networks are about 85% of the ammonia is from agriculture, and a large part of that is livestock production.
So explain why we the difference, I guess. Why do we think it's coming from the manure versus, say, a fertilizer application? If, all things being equal, if you had that ammonia being applied in manure form versus fertilizer form, is there a difference that makes it link back to a livestock production system versus a crop production system? And in Cayuga County and the counties around the Finger Lakes, right? Those two things cross over so much. That's why I'm asking that question. I'm trying to figure out, as someone who deals with nutrient management, how can we target our efforts? And
yeah. Wow, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I can answer it. Bob Howard, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, the manure production in the county, in the areas we're looking at are quite high. Fertilizer levels, synthetic fertilizers are lower overall. And our models, looking at the total surplus of nitrogen from all sources, manure, food imports, etc., suggests that in this area that the manure is a far larger source of nitrogen surplus generally than is the synthetic fertilizer one might use otherwise. On top of that, we're seeing the strong seasonal pulse of ammonia, which is tied to when people are spreading the manure. So we strongly think it's manure. Happy to talk offline further about that.
Yeah,
with
that's
you.
super interesting. I know that my colleagues, I think would love to have that conversation.
Yeah,
'cause I
let's
think
have
about-
that conversation and with others in
Yeah.
our lab and at Cornell. We'd
Awesome.
be happy to have that conversation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good deal. And I'm glad you're so close to be able to share that information. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kirsten. Julie, I see your hand up.
It went to sleep. We're getting some great questions, and I've actually seen this presentation or something like it twice now, which was actually really good because I have a prayer of understanding a tiny bit more. I was just wondering if anyone out there is starting to do some experiments in the lab with populations of cyanobacteria in a captive setting, and that's in the atmosphere over the water is being controlled, so they can see how everything else being equal, or as close to equal as we can get at how different concentrations of these reduced nitrogen compounds are affecting their growth or their growth. Anybody know if are people working with that yet?
I'm not familiar with any studies, but I know there have been lake-wide studies that have shown that there does seem to be a connection between reduced forms of nitrogen and increasing cyanobacteria blooms.
Tom, can I just
Yeah.
interject there? I mean, the growth rate of the cyanobacteria in these lakes, all of the lakes concerned in the Finger Lakes, is clearly phosphorus related, right?
Mhm.
So I think we know that adding more nitrogen is not going to increase the growth rate. The critical issue is nitrogen allows the cyanobacteria to produce these toxic compounds, and our back of the envelope calculations suggest that a fair amount of the nitrogen in the lakes is going into these toxic compounds. And what does that mean? It means that it's a public health issue, but it also means that the blooms might last longer and be more widespread in space, because the critters, the cyanobacteria, the compound, the organisms would graze on them. Excuse me, the zooplankton, the benthic filter feeders are more limited in their ability to take them down. So our working hypothesis, at least my working hypothesis, is that the nitrogen isn't contributing to their growth; it's contributing to their increased toxicity and therefore their ability to form longer and more persistent blooms.
Oh, thank you for that. That you're absolutely right. The phosphorus is the limiting growth factor.
Oh, absolutely. In all, at least 11, 10 out of 11 of the Finger Lakes, absolutely.
But then we have
including,
this mystery of why, if we're a fairly low phosphorus lake, that we have them in the first place.
yeah, I mean, and Skinnails is the perfect case, right? I mean, it's an oligotrophic lake. EPA listed as one of the highest water quality lakes in the entire United States, and that's true in terms of its phosphorus input. But you can still have these toxic blooms in a very, very low productivity lake such as Skinnails Lake, and the ammonia might contribute more to the toxicity and therefore more to the blooms.
Mm.
And this, I don't think there's any. I do think the agricultural sources are contributing to that. I don't think the farmers are to blame. We as scientists didn't anticipate this as a problem a decade or so ago. This is new science. It's a new world we're living in, but we need to adapt to it too.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very good, informative. Within the chat, we have a question from Jeff Randall, and kind of touched on this. Is phosphorus being measured? Is it not a major contributor? I know you touched on that.
The Finger Lakes Institute is certainly measuring phosphorus. We are only measuring gaseous ammonia.
Mhm. Thank you. And from Peter Kaplan, how is raising water temperature impacting overall lake health?
Well, most people think that that is one of the reasons why we're seeing more harmful algae blooms all over the place, is because the water temperatures are warming, and cyanobacteria actually do better at higher temperatures than a lot of other algae in the water.
Mhm.
So I would certainly consider it a contributing factor. High temperatures. So this talk I attended that Charlie Driscoll gave, he said large high wind conditions which rock the water back and forth, that's called a seiche, can stir up sediments that releases phosphorus. And if the water temperature is high and then you have a period of very calm weather, that's what leads to the concentration of these harmful algae blooms. But Charlie also mentioned that, yes, the toxicity of these blooms is certainly at least partially controlled by nitrogen, especially reduced forms.
Hmm. We have another question from Roxana Johnson. Why is nitrogen deposition switched from oxidized to reduced forms? And is that a global or a US phenomenon?
Good question. So we have actually done a very good job of controlling SO2 emissions and nitrogen oxide emissions. And so we have a lot less because we've controlled nitrogen oxide emissions through controls on power plants, and also cars, catalytic converters reduce nitrogen oxide emissions too. We've reduced the emissions considerably, and so we're getting a lot less nitrate in the form of, say, nitric acid in the atmosphere. Whereas emissions of ammonia have basically stayed the same. Now, another thing that's occurring is, so we've reduced SO2 and NOx emissions, which form nitric acid and sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. We have about 10% of the acidity that we had back in the early 70s. Now it's really reduced considerably. But those used to be neutralized by ammonia. Ammonia would form ammonium sulfate and ammonium nitrate, and the ammonia gas would be taken out of the air, and then it would be in particulate form, and then it would go into long range transport and come down somewhere else. Well, we don't have the nitric and sulfuric acid in the atmosphere like we used to. So even though emissions have not changed that much, the concentrations of ammonia are going up because it's not acting as a neutralizing agent and forming ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate.
Sorry, let me get unmuted. Thank you. That was a good explanation. Phil, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I've heard that when you get to warmer weather, that the cyanobacter gets stressed by the heat. Do we have any ideas about how hot does it have to get when it gets stressed and it produces the mycotoxins? Do we have any ideas what kind of range of heat will cause more mycotoxin production, or which strains of the cyanobacter produce more toxins with the heat?
I'm not a cyanobacteria expert by any means, but I do know that they do better under warmer conditions than other forms of phytoplankton in the water column. Their productivity goes up under warmer temperatures where other forms of planktonic algae they start getting stressed out before the cyanobacteria do. But I don't know what kind of maximum temperature it takes to decrease the productivity of the cyanobacteria.
one of the things that's interesting is that one of the reasons you get the coral bleaching is because in the corals, usually it's the cyanobacter that's producing the carbohydrates and feeding the polyps. And the bleaching happens when the cyanobacter starts to produce toxins. Then the polyps spit out the cyanobacter, and then you get the bleaching. And there's some corals that bleach easier than others. I guess it's depending on the cyanobacter or the polyps or the interaction. And there's a lot of variables, but it might be interesting in the future. Yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting observation.
And I think it just supports that there's a need for more study with all this change. I mean, this is not what it was 10 years ago. And it is just puzzling in so many levels as we look at land use and land cover. And you're right, and atmospheric watershed, I hadn't really put much thought into that and how things do move hundreds of miles. It's been a very informative discussion here tonight. Are there any other questions or messages through the chat that you'd like to share? All right, so it's been very informative. I appreciate your time, Tom, and also Bob, and the input from the others. Kirsten had some excellent questions as we look at nutrient management. Agriculture is, our major economic pulse here in our community, so it's very important. I do think I see Tom is exactly right that reductions in sulfuric acid, I think, about nitric acid, have changed the atmospheric chemistry, meaning reduced acid base neutralization. We've also seen increases in ammonia or NH3 ammonia from wildfires, which is a new area of research on the East Coast. Yeah. So I guess we know how to reach you if there are more concerns or questions that arise. And appreciate your time here tonight. I know I have been very, very much interested in why is the toxicity levels of the HABs increasing when we know that many of the nutrients are reducing, and our farmers are injecting, and our farmers are using methane digesters, and there's so many best management practices being out there, but there's a need for more study and research. So I appreciate what you do, Tom and Bob and the others here on your team. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Our next public forum will be in October. We will have Dr. Adam Effler with us that evening, who is the Executive Director of the Owasco Lake Watershed Management Council. And he will be touching on his work with the 9-element plan to reduce phosphorus within the Owasco watershed. So again, thank you so much for your support here with OWLA and this important conversation on atmospheric ammonia deposition.
Well,
Just wish you all a good evening.
Yeah, thanks a
You're
lot.
welcome.
This has been very good.
Yeah, and we'll see you out and about, especially on Tuesdays.
On
When
Tuesdays.
you're here in our area. Good deal.
Thank you, Ann. And again,
Yes.
Tom, great presentation. I just have to say, Tom has done an incredible job of pulling this work together. It's been an incredible amount of work, and we've been underfunded for quite some time, but he's done amazing work nonetheless. And he's had, we have had incredible community support to make it happen. And I really want to thank and acknowledge everyone in the area for having contributed in this way. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you again. All right, then. I think we've kind of covered it all. Some thank yous are coming through the chat. So again, thank you. Stay well. Hope to see you in the near future. Have a lovely evening. Enjoy your
Thank you,
summer.
Tom. It was a great talk.
Great.
Good night.
Hey, Melissa.
Hi. Thank you.
Melissa's responsible for the analysis of
Yay, all right, Melissa, keep it
of
going.
ammonia.
No,
So
I'm really
important.
appreciative of this localized study. Thank you. It tells us a lot about what's happening over air or land versus water. Thank you.
Yeah, very
Ann?
welcome. Thank you for all your work.
Ann,
Yes, Carol.
I got distracted. Did you answer the question that's asked where we could find the recording?
I did not see that by Michelle, pardon. Yes, my understanding is that Dave Carr will be posting this on our YouTube video site, the Owasco Watershed Lake Association. So Dave, by tomorrow, you think?
Sure.
All right.
Yes, if not tomorrow, Friday, yes. We'll get up there.
Friday. So it'll be there, Michelle,
As soon as
by
we can.
Friday on our YouTube site. Very good. Enjoy it. I'm going to listen to it again myself. All right. I'm
Thanks,
gonna leave.
everyone.
Good night.
Okay.
Bye.